If you've studied the Cold War in any real depth, or if you're old enough to remember living through it, there's one fact you almost certainly know. The Soviet Union built submarines on a massive scale. And massive really does mean massive. While the Soviet surface fleet was nothing to dismiss, the overwhelming focus of their naval effort went into underwater forces. From early diesel-electric designs to enormous missile submarines and the blisteringly fast Alpha class, these boats represented the pride of the Soviet Navy in many respects. However, they were not immune to the collapse of the state that created them. Another well-known reality is that the Soviet Navy fell apart alongside the Soviet Union itself. With funding drying up and resources becoming extremely limited, the newly formed Russian Navy simply could not afford to maintain the enormous Soviet-era fleet. This reality became obvious when looking at the larger surface ships, with vessels like the Kirov class largely falling out of service by the early years of the 21st century. The same situation played out beneath the waves. Many submarines were left idle, deteriorating in port. Photographs from the 1990s and early 2000s vividly capture this decline, submarines rusting away while pressed against one another or sitting abandoned and frozen into the ice. As Russia's economy slowly stabilized, many of these boats were eventually scrapped. But during the years they remained untouched, they offer a fascinating look at what happens when a navy suddenly loses the resources needed to sustain itself. It's one thing to examine inactive shipyards like Bremerton. It's something entirely different to witness truly abandoned warships left to decay. Let's begin with Vladivostok around the year 2000. In these images, we see a group of submarines sunk in shallow water, steadily rusting away. Two of them are barely visible above the surface. I'll admit I'm no specialist when it comes to Soviet submarine design, but these appear to be Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarines, also known as Project 641. They're too small to be ballistic missile submarines, and Soviet nuclear attack boats have very distinctive sail profiles and bow shapes. For comparison, a Foxtrot in operational condition shows a clearly recognizable bow sonar housing and sail design. Earlier Whiskey-class boats had narrower bows, more reminiscent of the German Type XXI, while the Romeo class featured different bow and sail shapes altogether, and only around 20 of those actually served with the Soviet Navy, compared to more than 50 Foxtrots. The retirement timeline also fits, with the last Foxtrots leaving service in the late 1990s. Overall, these submarines appear largely intact. The sonar dome coating at the bow is still present, as is the hydrophone window on the sail. Some hull plating is missing in places on both boats, though it's unclear whether this resulted from early scrapping efforts or simple deterioration. Aside from that damage and the expected corrosion, they don't actually look too terrible. That would make sense if they had been abandoned perhaps 5 years before the photo was taken, or possibly even less. The submarine in the background, however, is in noticeably worse condition. Looking closer, the rusting is much more severe. You can also clearly see the fin-like structure at the rear of the sail. Before continuing, it's worth making a brief clarification. The terms sail and conning tower are often used interchangeably when talking about submarines. I remember this coming up in comments when I previously discussed other vessels. As a general, though not absolute rule, sail is more commonly used for Cold War-era submarines and later, while conning tower is more typical for boats from the World War periods. That said, there's no strict rule, and both terms appear across both eras. I'm using sail here simply because it's more commonly applied to submarines of this period. Returning to the image, this particular submarine appears to have been abandoned earlier than the one beside it. It's not entirely clear what it's resting against, possibly some sort of buoy or structure, but I'm sure someone more knowledgeable will identify it. What's immediately obvious is that the boat is tilting at a dangerous angle. As for the submarine itself, rust has begun to encroach on the sonar coating at the bow, and the opening in the hull looks more like a component that was removed rather than simple damage. This boat also sits noticeably deeper in the water. Interestingly, despite all of that, it still looks to be in better condition than the submarine directly next to it. That adjacent submarine also appears to be a Foxtrot, based on the fin at the rear of the sail and the shape of the bow.
It still retains additional equipment mounted at the very tip of the bow. At the same time, it looks even heavier corroded, suggesting it was likely abandoned earlier than the other two. We get a clearer view of this submarine in the next set of images. There isn't a huge amount to discuss here, as many submarines lack surface features by design, especially after deck guns disappeared from submarine warfare. Still, there are a few points worth noting. Most striking is the amount of equipment still present and the relatively limited scrapping, despite this submarine appearing visibly older and more degraded than the others. In fact, it's arguably more intact overall. The sail hasn't been altered much and still has antennas extending upward. The bow-mounted equipment remains in place as well. Aside from extensive rust and minor signs of dismantling around the sail, there's little else to point out. The same applies to the more distant image of this submarine. It provides a good overall view, but not much additional detail, aside from a clearer look at whatever structure sits beside the submarines. To wrap things up, we return to the first submarine, this time viewed from the side. There's not a great deal new to observe, but it still offers a useful perspective. From this angle, the opening in the hull appears even more likely to be the result of scrapping activity, particularly compared to the sail and the opening located below it.
There is clearly extensive scrapping damage visible on the sail itself, as well as on the opening located beneath it. In any case, the position of this submarine, wedged between a heavily rusted and partially dismantled Foxtrot and comparatively well-maintained surface warships in the background, is visually striking. As for the remaining photographs, I'll move through them fairly quickly, since they depict the same submarines with only two exceptions, and there's little change in their condition beyond being buried under snow and ice. That seasonal transformation is immediately apparent in the first image, where one of the pair near the structure is completely frozen in. In fact, it's so thoroughly encased in ice that people are casually walking around it. It's one thing to hear about Russia's long-standing desire for access to warm-water ports, and quite another to see a port, Vladivostok in this case, entirely frozen over. Regarding the submarine itself, the only noticeable differences are a clearer view of the corrosion and several holes in the sonar coating. The next image returns to the first submarine once again, but this time another Foxtrot has appeared alongside her. While the original boat remains in roughly the same condition, weather effects aside, the second submarine is buried all the way up to her sail. This isn't the familiar image of a Soviet submarine breaking through Arctic ice, something we see depicted so often. The following image illustrates this even better. There's no visible sign of the hull of the second submarine at all, while the first shows much more obvious scrapping damage to the sail. Much of the forward section has been completely removed, exposing the internal structure, and it also appears that part of the deck forward of the sail has been scrapped as well. To conclude the Vladivostok section, we're left with three straightforward images. The first shows men fishing beside a partially buried Foxtrot. Honestly, this might be one of the most quintessential images of late 1990s to early 2000s Russia I've ever seen. The economic situation at the time was far from strong, to put it mildly. There's not much more to say about the submarine itself here, so we move on to the next image. This one shows one of the submarines from the rear, with the hull cracking through the ice. Judging by the ice pattern toward the bow, I believe this is the first submarine we examined earlier. The missing hull plating and damage to the sail seem to match. This image is particularly useful for illustrating how the ice has enveloped the submarine and where parts of the hull are still managing to remain above frozen water. In the final image from Vladivostok, active scrapping is clearly underway on the buried submarine. The sail is being cut into, and you can also see additional sections of missing deck on the first boat. Despite the harsh conditions, and despite fishermen going about their business in the background, work continues. That persistence is arguably the most interesting aspect of the scene, perhaps even more so than the submarines themselves. With that, we conclude the Vladivostok portion of this discussion. The remaining images come from other locations, though we'll spend less time on them. The next set involves what can only be described as an underwater graveyard. 3 Soviet nuclear submarines now rest on the seabed of the northern seas. One of these, a Komsomolets, sank in the Barents Sea after a fire.
I've covered that vessel in detail before, so I'll simply link that video elsewhere. The other two submarines sank in very different circumstances. The first is K-27, which was deliberately scuttled off the coast of an island on September 6, 1982. This boat was a modified version of the November-class submarine, and by most accounts a rather troublesome one. She was laid up in 1968 and eventually sunk as surplus to requirements in 1982. K-27 is by far the shallowest of the three wrecks discussed here, resting at a depth of just 33 meters or 108 feet. Because of this, her wreck has actually been surveyed by divers. However, very few images from these surveys have been released publicly, which is why she doesn't yet warrant a dedicated video. The photographs that do exist show a largely intact wreck, rusted certainly, but not actively disintegrating. Before sinking her, the Soviets sealed the reactor compartment by filling it with a sealing compound. At the time, this was believed to be sufficient to keep the wreck safe. In more recent years, concerns over potential contamination have led to further surveys and even plans to recover the hull in order to properly dispose of the reactor. Those plans, however, appear to have stalled, leaving the submarine to continue corroding on the seabed unless a new salvage effort is organized. Similar recovery plans were once proposed for the next submarine, K-159, another November-class boat, though a more standard example. She was decommissioned in 1989 and slated for scrapping, but the process did not proceed as intended. The submarine remained unattended for roughly 14 years, during which time the hull steadily deteriorated. By 2003, the situation had become so serious that proper disposal was urgently required. The concern was significant enough that 5 Baltic and Scandinavian countries paid Russia to dispose of several decommissioned nuclear submarines, including K-159. Her condition was so poor that pontoons had to be welded to her sides to keep her afloat. Unfortunately, those pontoons were themselves in poor condition and ultimately failed. With 10 Russian sailors on board, K-159 was towed away on August 28, 2003. 2 days later, a storm tore one of the pontoons free. Within hours, by around 3 a.m., the submarine sank off the coast of Mesh, leaving only one survivor. She now rests at a depth of 200 meters, or 656 feet, where she remains to this day, a potential radioactive hazard unless a salvage effort is eventually carried out. Honestly, judging by the condition of her stern during the tow, it's surprising she remained afloat for as long as she did. And with that, we come to the end of this journey, from shallow water Foxtrots in Vladivostok to shallow, mid-depth, and deep nuclear submarine graveyards in the Arctic. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the content, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.